Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your weekend flip. And actually, your first flip of the new year. That's right. We're talking about your first flip of the new year. It's going to be awesome and stuff like that. We're going to pick up right where we left off in class, right? And we were discussing or nerding out, really, like Mr. Terry was nerding him out, about the Dutch, right? So we were started talking about the Dutch and their rise to prominence during the 1600s, right? We were discussing how the Dutch are becoming a very large trade state and how they're actually going to inject themselves into that same market that the Portuguese were already in, right? So where we started off in class, we were talking about the Portuguese going into the Indian Ocean, right? They were going into the Indian Ocean following the voyage of Vasco da Gama in 1497, right? And they're going to go over there, and for about 100 years, the Portuguese are going to lock down the Indian coastline by making deals with those local princes, right? Those Rajas and stuff like that. Those provincial princes that would actually allow them to come in and protect them, quote unquote, from other European states, which never really actually occurred, but then also to get spices from those port cities and to actually try and create some type of sustainable trade relationship in the Indian Ocean. It became so prominent at one point that people referred to the Indian Ocean as the Portuguese lake, right? But by the 1600s, right, about 100 years goes by and stuff like that, and you're going to see the injection of other European cultures into these areas, right? Particularly in places like the Spice Islands and South Africa and stuff like that. And the Dutch are going to be one of the big competitors. Now, the Dutch, of course, as we know, are from the Netherlands, very well known for their clogs, braids, tulips, and also really big windmills. And we looked at pictures of Amsterdam, and we talked about modern day, like, Netherlands quite a bit in class today, talking about how, like, they are actually reclaiming land back from the ocean and stuff like that, and how they're a very, very phenomenal group of people that oftentimes doesn't get talked about in a lot of Western Civ or World Civilizations classes. But the Dutch are going to start setting up strategic locations in the Spice Islands and then also in South Africa to try and push the Portuguese out and get into that spice trade, right? They're going to set up a place in Cape Town, South Africa, and establish a very large colony there that's going to be a midway point from Europe all the way to India. They're also going to set up those areas in the Spice Islands and continue to move in on that Indian spice trade to create a foothold in Africa and move their way through. Now, they're going to come in, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they started a company. That's right, we're seeing the birth of a very important thing right now. A little tiny thing called capitalism, right? So capitalism is being born, and a lot of it you can actually give to the Dutch and the Netherlands for actually being able to do that, right? So the thing about it is the Dutch were able to do this not with their government, right? Their government actually, there in the 1600s and late 1500s, was tied up in the midst of war, right? So the Dutch government was in the middle of a war with Spain. It was a war called the 80 Years' War, right? Where they were trying to break away from Spain and become a modern-day independent country. Now, the thing about it, though, that's going to end up happening is this is going to enter in Dutch merchants. Now, something that to give you like kind of like a backstory to this whole thing, give you some background to everything else as well, is that the Dutch were a very large Protestant country. They had actually converted mostly to Calvinism and stuff like that, and you can see that in a lot of like Dutch art, and you can see it in a lot of Dutch things and Dutch, like for example, here is one called the Dutch Masters, which is an art and stuff, or a piece of artwork where and you can see it in pieces of art like this one, right? Like, so this painting right here is an old painting referred to as the Dutch Masters and stuff like that. Look at them. Look at what they're wearing, right? They're wearing black and white. They are Calvinist communities. There's nothing on these walls. It's ornate. Maybe some rugs and things like that that were brought in via trade negotiations and stuff like that coming from the Indian Ocean. But the thing was about the Dutch is that they were very prosperous, very entrepreneurial, and they were also very much about making money, right? They want to make money and be very, very large and intense and stuff like that, and they want to make a very large like contingent of boats and vessels. And so a thing that ends up being formed in the Netherlands is a thing known as the East India Company, right? The East India Company is going to be the very first version of an all-important concept known as a joint stock company. Do me a favor, write that word down. It's very, very important, right? Next to the East India Company right here, write joint, J-O-I-N-T, stock, S-T-O-C-K, company, a joint stock company. And what that is, it's an element where these merchants came together, much like the men that were sitting at that table, came together and decided to form a company, right? And the idea was, okay, I have 2 boats that I can lend to this company, right? Maybe my buddy like has 3 boats. Mr. Mathern has 3 boats, and Mr. Wooderson has 5 boats, right? So I'm lending 2 boats to that, so I get 2 boats worth of the profit every time we bring goods back in from these different areas. So effectively, what was created when the East India Company was created related is the stock market, right? The idea of buying shares in a company and then sharing in its profit. And it's going to be wildly successful because right here, this right here is the amount of market per capita of all the modern day companies that you can think of. Bell System, Apple, as you can see right here, is a very wealthy company and stuff like that, bringing in like almost $1 trillion. Microsoft, Standard Oil. But then look at this. The Dutch East India Company, right, moved over $7 trillion worth of capital during their entire reign and their entire existence, lasting from about 1602 forward, okay? Now, the East India Company is going to be making all that money because of the collective idea of these merchants coming together and sharing in each other's profits and creating that all-important stock market, and this is a very large element of capitalism, right? Now, the EIC, as we can oftentimes refer to it as, the East India Company, is a full sovereign company. That means they're not controlled by the government in essence. Like, they can go and do what they please. They actually went out to the Indian Ocean, to the Spice Islands and all these different areas and set up different colonies and different processing centers and stuff like that, and were actually operate full-fledged on their own, and the Dutch government would benefit from it by taxing them and taking in a little bit of their profits, right? Now, the East India Company would dominate trade in Asia, surpass the Portuguese, and push them out. But here's the interesting thing. They aren't the only ones that had an East India Company, right? And ironically enough, they didn't even come up with the idea first, all right? So there were two different East India Companies that were floating around in the waters during this time period, starting in the 1600s, that are going to become massively important, and they're going to come up repeatedly throughout the rest of this course, at least up until like the 1800s, right? The East India Company is even referenced in prominent films like the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? Jack Sparrow fights against members of the British East India Company, because that's right, we got two of them. We have a British East India Company and a Dutch East India Company, right? And the funny thing about it is you can tell the difference between these two companies by their brand names and their brand logos, right? So something to understand about branding. What is branding? What is marketing? What is all those things, elements of capitalism and stuff like that? Well, the thing about it is when you're looking at it, if I show y'all this symbol, that is the brand name of a modern day company you know very well. That's Nike. That's the Nike check, right? The reason why it's called a brand name or a brand logo is because they used to actually in the 1600s, the Dutch and the British East India Companies would take a symbol that represented their company, heat it up over fire, and brand it into casks or into like actual boxes that carried their goods in them to let people know that that's the company that brought those goods in, right? And you could always tell these two places with two things that you need to draw real quick. These two symbols, right? These are the symbols, the brand names of the Dutch and the British East India Companies, right? This one right here is the British one, right? As you can see, it's three crosses, East India Company. That is the British or the English East India Company. And the Dutch one is this one right here, the V, the O, and the C, okay? So go ahead really quick and hit pause, draw these symbols in there real quick, and make sure you label it the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, right? You need to make sure that you know those, okay? Because it's important because we're discussing the growth of commercialism right now. We're talking about the growth of commercial economics and the growth of commercial revolution that's going to be happening, and you're going to see a buttload of products coming in through European ports. It's going to drastically change the name of the game. So go ahead and hit pause, draw these bad boys real quick. Good job. Appreciate y'all doing that, okay? But let's keep going a little bit, right? So the big thing about it is when we're looking at this trade document right here that was used by one of these companies. How do we tell whose it is? Oh, right there, right? That right there is the symbol of the Dutch East India Company, right? The thing about it in general is, though, is that you need to understand is commercialism is on the rise, right? What we're seeing is all these products are coming in through these new ports, and so you're seeing the growth of the idea that Europeans now have access to goods that they never actually had access to before, and they had access to them at cheaper prices, right? You're now seeing spices become affordable, right? Spices weren't a huge item for hundreds and hundreds of years. Eventually, the market became saturated by them, and we're going to see the growth of supply and demand economics. Now, we'll talk about all that stuff a little bit later on, and we'll loop these companies back in there in a little bit, right? But the big thing about it is to wrap up the Asian theater, the British and the Dutch East India Companies would battle for control over the Indian Ocean for quite some time, leading to wars and massive economic expansion. Now, in the long run, the British are going to win out, and actually, the British went in and took over India for over 200 years, right? So just keep that in mind, but we'll talk a lot about that when we get to imperialism in the 1800s, right? That's like 2-3 units away though, okay? So don't worry about it too much, but the big thing about it is those East India Companies and the birth of capitalism is still very, very important, okay? So looking at it as well, we're now also seeing the growth of American exploration, right? Not American as in America today, but I mean the Americas, all right? North and South America. We now know that Columbus's voyage has resulted in the Spanish becoming aware of these brand new two continents, right? These these two new places, North and South America, that lie in the West that they can go and get and go have access to, and they may or may not have goods that the Spanish want, right? Well, the thing about it is that Columbus's voyage is going to cause a massive chain of events that is going to drastically change the progression of history for forever, right? Now, the thing about it is where did he land, right? We know that he landed in the Caribbean, right? And he landed specifically in the Bahamas and began to bounce around the Caribbean islands. Well, there was a group of people that he came into contact with initially, right? When he actually set up shop in the Caribbean islands. They are these people known as the Taino people, right? The Taino people are natives from the Caribbean. Now, the thing that ends up happening is once Columbus sets foot in the Caribbean and the Taino people begin to see him and the settlers and the colonists and stuff like that, they actually welcome Columbus with open arms. They actually welcomed them with open arms, brought them trade items, brought them goods in the hopes of trading with them and trying to foster a positive relationship. However, the relationship is going to go quickly downhill because one of the biggest prerogatives that Columbus wanted to do was to convert them to Christianity. Now, the big thing about it, though, that this is going to become a problem, of course, going later on, and it's going to become even a larger problem when the Reformation begins in 1517, okay? When we're not quite there yet, it's about 20 years down the road, but a big thing about it is that the European colonists, one of their biggest efforts is always going to be to try and convert the natives to Christianity, even though they don't want to be converted. And so the thing about it is that the Taino people are going to refuse that Christianity, and things are going to start getting very, very bad, all right? Columbus is then going to take over their land. He's going to use this as a prerogative to actually take them over and enslave them, and this is going to lead to basically a mass genocide, right? There is now 95% of all Taino people after this contact was initiated are going to perish due to a number of different reasons, right? Because Columbus actually left a very large group of colonists behind under the leadership of his brother. Now, Columbus, after he discovered these areas, or after he found these areas in the Bahamas and stuff like that, he's not going to stay there permanently. He actually went on several different voyages, right? He went on 4 different voyages where he would go and come back, and go and come back, and go and come back. And so when he left at one point on his going back, first of all, he did one of the most screwed up things ever. He brought Taino people as gifts for Isabella and Ferdinand. Yes, he gave people away to the royals of Spain as gifts. That is absolutely deplorable and disgusting. And also, not to mention the fact as well, is that he began to force the Taino people before he left to gather gold, okay? So the big thing about it is that Columbus and the colonists are going to discover that there are small deposits of gold in the Caribbean islands, mainly just due to the fact they're wearing jewelry that had gold on them. And the other big thing that happened is they even asked them, hey, where did you get that jewelry from? Where is this gold around your neck from? And they were like, well, we have a little bit here, but over in what is now Mexico, they have a lot, right? So this is going to create a bloodlust and a gold rush from the Spanish in general, okay? They also, the thing is that when Columbus leaves and comes back, the colonists that he left behind were very, very, very violent. Just as violent as Columbus against the natives. There was murder. There was like assault. There was physical assault. They literally were documented evidence of like them cutting off like natives' hands if they didn't collect enough gold to fill a bell. They would actually cut natives' ears off in front of other natives to try and make them afraid of the Spanish colonists to do what they told them to do, right? Murder, assault, robbery, torture was a thing. They apparently also even threw natives into pits with Spanish war dogs to watch the dogs tear them apart. So the thing that's going to end up happening, though, because of all this, when Columbus comes back, he actually is going to hold someone accountable for it, and he's going to actually have a colonist executed for their crimes against one of the natives for unprerogative, blah, 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 whatever. But what ends up happening in Columbus in the long run is he actually gets arrested and returned back to Spain, and he dies like poor and miserable and stuff like that. And all those goods and all those islands and all those lands passed directly to Isabella and Ferdinand. Now, Columbus, though, and all the atrocities that he committed, which we'll talk more about in class, was the first wave of these people known as conquistadors, right? Now, what a conquistador is a Spanish conqueror, right? So, like, Columbus is a conquistador, a guy that we'll talk about later named Hernan Cortez is a conquistador, Francisco Pizarro is a conquistador. The thing that's interesting to bring up, though, is a lot of kids always ask me, they're like, wait a minute, though, Mr. Terry, Columbus had like a couple hundred sailors. The Taino people, the Aztecs, the Incas, the former Mayas, like all those people, the Native American tribes of North America, there were millions of them. How is it possible that millions of natives lost or did so poorly in battles against the Spanish? Well, first of all, there were some native victories, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on, especially when we get back in class. But the biggest reason why is because they, you gotta really emphasize this. I forgot to delete it right here, which is very important, but the big thing is because the Spanish had weapons that the natives had never seen before. Guns, cannons, horses, and many, many, many different other types of things, right? And these weapons are going to give the Spanish the ability to conquer and actually kill people very efficiently. And the other big reason is because Europeans also carried several different diseases with them. They carried smallpox, measles, influenza, several diseases that would kill the natives at a rate of 90% because the natives had no immunity or resistance to those diseases. So something that you need to write down real quick and then underline it like 6 times because it's wildly important is it all boils down to this. Write this down. The natives did not have forgeable metals, okay? Forgeable is spelled Forgeable, forgeable, which means that they didn't have access to metals that you could heat up and then pound into a shape and then sharpen to an edge to use against another foe, right? So that's going to be a big thing. The Incas, for example, were still using rock weapons and things like that. They just didn't have access to iron or bronze and stuff like that at the time, so they couldn't fight the Spanish off effectively. And the other big thing that's going to happen is they did not domesticate large animals. So you should have on that little thing I just told you to write down, the natives did not have forgeable metals and they did not domesticate large animals. Now, what the large animals piece is going to happen is that large animals are the reason why Europeans had smallpox, influenza, measles, because as we talked about in the beginning of the year with the Neolithic agricultural revolution that happened over in Southeast Asia, Mesopotamia, all those areas, and then also in Greece, what's going to end up happening is constant access and exposure to animals is going to lead to exposure to viruses that those animals have, and things like smallpox, which we believe may be from rodents, influenza, which we think might come from swine, and then measles, which could come from any other variety of barnyard animal, jumped onto the Europeans, and so they had built up immunities to them over centuries. The natives didn't have large breed domesticated animals. They only had dogs, and then the Aztecs would actually domesticate turkeys and stuff like that, but they didn't have access to all these animals that would have actually given them immunity to these diseases, right? Now, what's going to happen next, though, is that the Americas is going to fall under the conquest of this guy named Cortez. So as we leave off right here, what's going to end up happening is Columbus is going to end up arrested, returned back to Spain in chains, right? But the Spanish were told by others, particularly about the gold jewelry that they had witnessed by the Taino people, that there was gold in what is now modern-day Mexico, right? Now, who controlled that area were these people known as the Aztecs, right? Now, Hernan Cortez, who is an absolute jerk, is going to be the guy that lands in Mexico in 1519 with the intent of conquering all of Aztec's lands and claiming their riches. And he wanted to head towards the Aztec capital city, known as Tenochtitlan, right? And he wanted to stop along the way and made alliances with people that the Aztecs conquered. But what I need you to do is go ahead and jot this stuff down, and I'm going to reteach this stuff to you in class, and we're going to go over it in totality, and I'm going to dork out about how awesome the Aztec people are and how phenomenally advanced they were. It's going to be a lot of fun. Can't wait to see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.